It is week 2, and this week we are going to read a couple of short stories, and there are quite a few lessons on MLA format and the elements of the short story because we're going to be talking about plot and characterization. There is no discussion this week, but there is a journal entry, and it will cover aspects of both of the short stories that you are going to read. But I want to talk a little bit about plot and characterization. Later in the week, I will post an optional lesson on the elements of the short story. But again, this week emphasizes plot and characterization. Plot is extremely important to a story. And the elements of the plot, there's usually 3 steps, and they are called by different names. For example, it can be the introduction, the rising action, and the falling action. Or, as I prefer, the introduction has a conflict, and you need to know the conflict fairly soon. And then there is the conflict reaches a crisis, and then there is a resolution or a denouement. Now, there are stories that do not have these steps, and there are called, and novels as well, called slice of life. And usually what happens in these slice of life works, there's no resolution. And they are basically just following somebody in a day or a year of their life. And I can think of Saul Bellows' Seize the Day, which personally I did not care for because there was no really big crisis and there was no resolution. But that's my personal opinion. But they don't have a huge crisis, or there is no resolution to the crisis. But as human beings, we like those steps in the plot. We want there to be a crisis, but we also want there to be a resolution. So why do we want there to be a crisis? Because that's how real life works. We do not go through real life with everything being roses and eating chocolate without gaining any weight. So we also want a resolution to the problem because we're dissatisfied if we do not get a resolution. Now, when I explain this and how important the resolution is, I like to use the examples of the first Star Wars movie. Most of you are too young to have been in a movie theater in 1977, but hey, I stood in line to watch that movie, and it was probably the first movie I ever stood in line to watch. So I sat through this movie. There were quite a few conflicts. There were quite a few crises. But when we came down to the end of the movie, and Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader were fighting, and Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father." And then instead of being killed or explaining all of this, he goes away and did the bad guys have the X-Wing fighters? Not important, but there was no resolution. We didn't learn the circumstances or even whether Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. And we wanted the bad guy to be punished, but he wasn't. He got away. Now, at that time, we did not know there were going to be another 2 movies, and then another 3 movies, and then another 3 movies. And all of this did eventually get resolved. Now, there was a deliberate decision not to have a resolution to this because there were sequels. But if this had been a movie in and of itself, that there were going to be no sequels, there would have been even more disappointed people over the years in that we didn't find out what happened. Sometimes the resolution is not so apparent, and sometimes the crisis and the conflict are a bit, I can't think of the word that I want, but take Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery. If you've read that, you know that it is about, I'm not gonna do any spoiler because if you haven't read it, you should read it. But in this short story, the resolution would be the crisis in another story, because in the story, a person is stoned. And that should be a crisis, but not in this story. It was a resolution. So sometimes they are, I still can't think of the word that I want, but they're not always very cut and very dry. So as you read these 2 stories, take into consideration, what is the conflict in this story? What is the crisis? Is there a crisis? How strong is it? and what is the resolution. And of course, there are plot twists and different aspects. In movies are the same way. Movies have the same elements as a short story, and so do novels. It's just that they're longer and more drawn out. Characterization is also extremely important, and there are different kinds of characterization. Sometimes we know about the characters because in third person omniscient, we know all of their thoughts. We know everything they do. In limited omniscience, we only know the thoughts of one observer, and we don't know what the motives behind why people are doing what they are doing. And then there is no omniscience, which is can still be in third person, where we don't know what anybody's thinking, and we only see what is on the page. There's my cat. And then there are other ways that we learn about characters. First person, we'll learn about narration later. First person, we only know what one person is saying about the other character. So we always have to take into account whether or not that narrator in first person is biased or prejudiced or is giving us the full story. Now, in Updike's story, A and P, it is a first person narrator. And it is a young man, and he's talking about these young women who come into the store dressed in bathing suits. What's the conflict there? What's the crisis? What is the resolution? But can you trust what the narrator is saying about the other characters in this story? How do you learn about these characters? Is the narrator being honest? Is he even being honest about his own feelings? And how does he portray these people? So always take these things into account when you are reading a story, because the narration affects the characterization. And then there are different kinds of characters that I'm not going to go into. Well, I mentioned some of them. There are static characters. They never change. There are evolving characters that they change over the course of the story or the novel. But I'm not going to go into that much detail because I'm already at 7.5 minutes, and I know you're getting bored already. So, plot and characterization and the other elements will be coming at different in the future. Now, again, this week I mentioned that there is no discussion, but there is a journal entry that will be discussing the stories, and there is a quiz. I think I'm just going to wrap up there, and I know that I rambled in talking about plot and characterization, but remember, I don't script these things. I don't script them at all, and so it's kind of stream of consciousness, and that is another type of narration. And so I'm going to end it at that. We're going to get on to the second week, and I think that's all I have to say.